smells like lavender, cleans like Clorox, and feels like...
All right, that could go on for a while. Experience the long-lasting freshness of Clorox Scentiva, available in Clorox Scentiva Lavender Scented Bleach. Use as directed.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime from every angle. We've talked to reporters, we've talked to gangsters, we've talked to victims of gangsters, we've talked to family members of gangsters, we've talked to mafia turncoats, you name it, we've spoken of them. The one subject that I don't know that we've ever gotten into on this podcast, at least not in any depth, has been the affiliations that the most powerful man in the world, the president, has with the mob. That is until now. On the radio recently, I had on Eric Dezenhall. He's the author of a new book called Wise Guys and the White House, Gangsters, Presidents, and the Deals They Made. He also happens to be a crisis management consultant extraordinaire. And when we did just the very basics of this interview, I was deluged with wanted to hear more. Well, now you will. Eric, welcome to the Racket Report. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So for people that didn't have the benefit of hearing our interview on the radio, which I hope they'll go back and listen to the podcast on, what first sparked your interest in exploring the connection between presidents and the mob?
Well, I grew up in southern New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, and it was not unusual to have a family member, a neighbor, a Little League coach who was tied to that world. And when I was in my early 20s, I was a young aide in Reagan's White House. And my boss asked me where I was from, and I told her, and she said, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, isn't that a mob town? And there was a big mob war going on. The local boss, Angelo Bruno, had just been killed, and bodies were turning up all over the place. And, I wasn't really thrilled with the description, but I said, yeah, you couldn't have said that Muhammad Ali lived in our town. And she said, boy, the mob, they killed President Kennedy. They run the country. And we're 20 feet from the Oval Office. And I'm thinking, what? What are you talking about? And what's interested me ever since is the gap between what we think is going on in the world and what is really going on. And it took me a very long time to try to figure out the difference between the mythology surrounding organized crime and politics, because we all have a bias toward the exotic, not the mundane.
Mm-hmm.
We want to believe that the Kennedy assassination was a mob conspiracy, even though it wasn't. We want to believe that the mob had a photo and compromised J. Edgar Hoover, which I don't believe is the case. But that said, the mob was a huge gear in presidential politics for much of the 20th century. And I go from FDR to the present day and talking about very specifically what we know, what we believe we can prove, and what is mythology. And there really is a lot there. There has been tremendous involvement, but it's not in the sense that at 3 o'clock in the morning, Tony Accardo was flying in from Chicago and sneaking into the Roosevelt room of the White House and briefing Harry Truman. That's just not how it works. But I talk in the book about how it does work.
Since you mentioned the Kennedy assassination, that's, I think, the most common aspect of mafiadom, that the John Q. public believes there's some connection with the mob and the presidency, maybe Lyndon Johnson, maybe others. Even when I spoke with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the show, he said that he believed, in words or substance, I'm paraphrasing, that there were certain aspects of the CIA that were in league with the mob in order to kill his father and his uncle.
Not true.
Explain to folks why that's not true, since you brought that one up.
Well, let's first talk about why one could believe it. I mean, the fact is in 1960, Joe Kennedy, and there's a tendency to put all the Kennedys together like they're one unit. They're not. And Joe Kennedy wanted help from labor to get JFK elected. Now, JFK was going after the mob in the Senate, and Bobby Kennedy was going after them as a Senate investigator. So Bobby specifically was after the mob hard. But Joe Kennedy thought that this was ridiculous, and there was a big blow up at Hyannis Port with Joe Kennedy saying, if Jack wants to get elected, how do you think you do that without labor? And Bobby was puritanical, and he didn't like it. But Joe Kennedy reached out to a man whose family I've known for many years, a man named Jimmy Alo, Vincent Alo, known as Jimmy Blue Eyes. If you saw The Godfather Part 2, there was a character, Johnny Ola. That is based loosely on Jimmy Alo, who was Meyer Lansky's partner. And in the movie, he was the partner of Hyman Roth, who was the Meyer Lansky stand-in. And Jimmy Alo had said, look, we just got done with Cuba. We're licking our wounds. We don't want to go screwing around in a presidential election. He and Meyer and Luciano and Frank Costello had felt burned because they supported Franklin Roosevelt in the primary, and when he was running for president, and Roosevelt had promised that he wouldn't go after the mob, and of course he did go after the mob. And Luciano later in life was asked about being stabbed in the back, and he said that Roosevelt was a no good blank double crosser. Of course, it was a good move, and I would have done the same thing. But Jimmy Alo felt burned, and he didn't want to help Joe Kennedy. He said, talk to your friend Sinatra. Joe Kennedy talked to Sinatra. Sinatra talked to Sam Giancana in Chicago, and the Chicago outfit basically took a vote and decided that to support Giancana, even though there were people like Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca, and Murray Humphreys who did not like the idea of screwing around in a federal election. They thought that there was too much risk, but they said Giancana could do it. And so Giancana got support for JFK in Illinois, in West Virginia, in New Jersey, and helped with labor. There is no question that happened. What there is a question about is when people start getting hyperbolic and saying they elected Kennedy. Well, we don't really know that. I mean, how do you prove that A equals B? I mean, there's no question that they had help. But one thing's for sure is Sam Giancana felt that he had helped elect JFK. And so that there is a basis for believing there is this relationship between the Kennedys and the mob. The other thing is Joe Kennedy needed mob help in Hollywood. He needed their help in the real estate business. He was not a bootlegger. Joe Kennedy was not a bootlegger because for Joe Kennedy to be a bootlegger, it would have been like Warren Buffett in the 1990s deciding to run a drug cartel. He had made a fortune. I mean, Joe Kennedy didn't like the idea of the Irish liquor person. He didn't want to deal with Italians, and he really didn't want to deal with Jews. But he was in the liquor business. But he did it legally. And one of the themes of this book that I hammer over and over again, it is the people who knew how to use organized crime who ended up faring better than the mafia themselves. Now, we then get to Cuba, where under Roosevelt, and by the way, I am coming back to the assassination, where Roosevelt, where under Eisenhower, there was a campaign to get rid of Castro. And later, Kennedy inherited it, and they called it Operation Mongoose. And the idea was to overthrow Castro, including by assassination. Bobby Kennedy was absolutely obsessed with killing Castro, which, by the way, a lot of people have a hard time believing because he goes down in history as this great liberal. I mean, Bobby Kennedy was a badass. And by the way, so was Roosevelt, who we'll get to. He wanted him dead. And he found out that the CIA, with whom he had been working with actively, had tapped the mob through Johnny Roselli of Los Angeles and Chicago and Santo Trafficante. Well, Bobby Kennedy hit the roof. To make a very long and complicated story short, after a lot of wrestling, the CIA ended up saying, Bobby, you're writing us every day about killing Castro. So you want him dead, but you only want us to use the nicest guys to do it? Now, who did you think we were going to call? The Daughters of the American Revolution? So Bobby Kennedy was not happy that the mob was used, but he also wanted him dead. And JFK was the same, wanted him dead. Now, then we get to the question that you smartly raised. Does the fact that the mob felt betrayed mean they're going to kill the President of the United States? That is a gross misread of who had the power and who didn't. And there is a certain percentage of people who follow the mob for whom the mob explains everything. Mob runs the country. Mob killed Kennedy. And there's no question that the mob was powerful. There's no question that the mob was violent. But there are very few things in life that I know for certain. But one of them is this. You do not screw with the federal government ever. And the mob had been wiretapped heavily in the early 60s illegally. There are no wiretaps that indicate anything other than shock that Kennedy was killed. A lot of them were happy he was killed, and terror that they were going to be blamed. One of my favorite ones was Angelo Bruno, my local mob boss, who was a big figure of where I grew up, saying, my God, they're going to come after us. I mean, one of my guys shoved an FBI agent, and they beat him nearly to death. In Chicago, something similar happened, and they completely destroyed a guy's house. This was for shoving an FBI agent. If you think that they were going to murder the President of the United States when they were at the top of their game, it's preposterous, especially Carlos Marcello, who is frequently blamed. Marcello, the guy who started that rumor, who I mentioned in the book, is a guy who I happen to know, who said Marcello told him he did it. And I pressed this guy, and he said to me that, yeah, Marcello told me he wanted, he wanted to get the stone out of his shoe. And I said to this person, why would he confide this in you? Well, he totally blew up at me. Now, this person was genuinely very wired in with mob stuff, but he also never heard about a mob conspiracy that he didn't have firsthand information to. And one of the if you said to him, hey, did you hear that Julius Caesar was stabbed? He would go, hey, that wasn't Brutus and Cassius. That was Joey Bag of Donuts. You see, Caesar bet on the Rams and was into him for 50 large. I mean, and so a lot of the problem with writing about the mob is just like the spy world, which I also write about, is you have a lot of people lying. If the mob wanted JFK gone, they would have just exposed his relationship with Judy Campbell, with whom there was an affair, with a mutual affair with Sam Giancana. There was so much dirt on him involving women, that would be the way to go. And you had guys like Marcello, who by that point in history, most of his business was legal, which was the goal. You're going to blow up your family, your biological family and your mob family, knowing that the federal government would descend upon you like an asteroid. I just don't think it's possible.
Right.
That said, Frank, it's a fun theory. It's a blast to believe that you screw with the mob, They're going to even kill the President of the United States. But, I talked to Warren Commission people. The idea that they would be involved in a cover-up like that. Jack Ruby comes into the picture. Yeah, he was a sleazy bar club owner. He was a nobody in terms of organized crime. And, where I grew up, everybody and their brother told you, yeah, you need something done. You let me know. Every guy with a toothpick in his mouth, is a major mob figure. And I have a running joke with a friend of mine who writes about the American Revolution, and I said the difference between your readers and my readers is none of your readers think that they were in the American Revolution. People who read mob books think they're in the mob. So Bobby Kennedy Jr., look, he's entitled to believe what he wants. It's his father, but he's just not right.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
So good, so good, so good.
Great brands, great prices. Everyone's got a reason to rack.
You know they have Marc Jacobs?
Nike? Yes.
Just so many good brands.
Vince, Birkenstock, and more brands you love are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
All right. Well, I appreciate you clarifying that. And it's clear you've done a lot of research in writing this book. That's evident in reading it. It's evident in talking to you. What were some of the biggest surprises that you uncovered while writing Wise Guys and the White House and researching this book?
Well, the biggest surprise was how wired in these guys were over many, many years. With Roosevelt and the program with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, which I can get to, the biggest surprise was that Harry Truman was probably our most mobbed-up president. He was a squeaky clean guy himself. No evidence that he ever took a bribe, and people know that he came. You read biographies of Truman, and you know that he came from this big political machine. What is not well understood is it was a mafia, Cosa Nostra controlled machine. And Truman, one of the reasons I think he didn't run again is because shortly before that time period, there was a mob murder in Democratic headquarters in Kansas City where one of the guys fell dead in front of his picture, his large blow-up photo. Truman was selected to run for the Senate by a mob machine that was so entrenched in Kansas City that when you called the Kansas City police, sometimes a mob lieutenant would answer and decide whether to dispatch the police or not, depending upon if it was sending somebody to one of their locations. What's interesting is I see no evidence that Harry Truman ever took a dollar, but one of the things that he said later in life in private diaries is, look, there were times I had to let a gangster steal in order to accomplish other ends of a program. I didn't like it, but I had to do it. And so that was a big thing. The other thing that was interesting is that the very same presidents that helped the mob in some way prosecuted the living daylights out of them. I mean, JFK benefited from mob involvement, but prosecuted them heavily. Richard Nixon, who famously commuted the sentence of Jimmy Hoffa in order to put Hoffa's then deputy in charge of the Teamsters in order to get their support, among other reasons, Richard Nixon signed the RICO law. Ronald Reagan, whose career mentor, Lou Wasserman, the Hollywood boss, who built MCA Universal on the back of mafia help, Reagan's administration launched the commission prosecution. So you say to yourself, how could this be? Well, the answer is one group had more power than the other, and it was the politicians who could do what they want. Number two, just because you benefited from the mob and went after the mob, it doesn't mean you benefited and prosecuted the same mobsters, because it was not all one central corporation. Reagan, for example, left alone Lou Wasserman's friends, Sidney Korshak and the Chicago guys. It was the New York Commission guys who he prosecuted. So it was very, very interesting the way all of this was navigated.
It certainly is, and I'm glad that you itemized it and collected it for the first time in a comprehensive manner in this book, and I hope people check out Wise Guys and the White House, Gangsters, Presidents, and the Deals They Made. You alluded to FDR and Lucky Luciano. FDR's deal with Luciano is often defended as a wartime necessity. In your research, did you find evidence that this relationship extended beyond just protecting the waterfront?
Yes, and I think that the way you characterized it is correct. There are things we do in wartime. I mean, the way I got catalyzed in the Luciano story is writing. I did a historical novel many years ago based on Meyer Lansky, a wing of whose family I've known for much of my life. And what ended up happening there is a few weeks after Pearl Harbor, the largest cruise ship in the world, which was being fitted for troop use, blew up and capsized at Pearl Harbor. At the time, that was Nazi sabotage because Nazi U-boats had been seen going up and down the Hudson River. We had lost thousands of tons of materiel from Nazi U-boats on the East Coast, and Nazi sabotage was suspected. The Navy went to the docks and tried to get help. Well, the guys on the docks don't like to support the federal government. They don't want to cooperate with somebody in a uniform. They don't want to be seen as snitches. And the other thing was that many of the dock workers were Italian. Italian Americans had been declared enemy aliens by Roosevelt. And the attitude on the docks is, why are we going to help you? So the feeling was, well, maybe these guys, the Italian Americans, are in bed with Mussolini, which really was not true. But they had trouble recruiting the Italians. And one of the prosecutors in New York, Murray Gerfine, who was Jewish and who was later became one of the Pentagon Papers judges, said, maybe you're going after the wrong mobsters. Meyer Lansky, who was arguably the most powerful Jewish mob figure of the 20th century, Meyer tried to enlist in the Army, but he was declined because of his age. He was 40 in 1942, and his height. He was 5'4", soaking wet. And he really wanted to serve. And Gerfine of the DA's office said, why don't you talk to the Jewish mobster? Maybe he'll talk to Luciano. And that's exactly what happened. Luciano was in prison doing 30 to 50 on a prostitution rap, which was dubious. And Meyer suggested to him, cooperate with this, and maybe we'll get you out. And Luciano was like, I don't know about this. And Meyer said, what better do you have to do? What more do you have to do here? And so what ended up happening is Luciano gave the command to a lieutenant named Sachs Lanza. So you have Lansky and Lanza. It's kind of confusing. Mm-hmm. And people on the waterfront, they allowed the Navy to infiltrate the docks, to be dock workers. They also made it very inhospitable for Nazi sympathizers around to New York to do business around the docks. And people say, what do you mean Nazis in New York? Nazis were very powerful in New York, believe it or not, in the 1930s and early 40s. I know that that's a hard thing to believe, but there was a section called Yorkville that was heavily German. There was a major Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, of all places. And one of the things that Lansky did was he sent teams in to beat the living daylights out of them. And one of the ways he got tips was, and I think you'll enjoy this, is one of President Roosevelt's greatest propagandists was the journalist Walter Winchell. Well, guess who Walter Winchell's neighbor was in the Majestic apartment building? Meyer Lansky.
Wow.
And so you have this line from a gangster to the president, and one day Meyer ran into Winchell in the lobby of the Majestic and said, hey, Walter, you gave me a bum steer. I sent some guys over to this location that you gave me, and then there weren't Nazis there. And Winchell got scared. He goes, Meyer, I'm so sorry. I mean, I really thought I gave you the right address. And Meyer said, don't worry, Walter. We got him. So you had that nexus. The other area where you're onto something is it went beyond the waterfront protection. And when it came time to invade Sicily, which General Patton, his Seventh Army did, and which General Montgomery did, they needed intelligence on how best to invade Sicily. Where do we come ashore? Who do we know there? And so Meyer brought with Luciano's help, a lot of Sicilian Americans to the Hotel Astor to meet with the Navy. Now, here's where it gets more interesting. Who did President Roosevelt appoint to be his top New York waterfront intelligence advisor? A man, his best friend, Vincent Astor, who helped him heal while he first developed polio. Vincent Astor of the very wealthy Astor family. The Hotel Astor was used for these meetings. So here you have yet another nexus from the mob through. The Sicilian Americans gave what ended up becoming Patton's army intelligence on the best the best beaches to come ashore. And the Navy appointed a number of Italian-American officers, one named Alfieri, one named Marzullo, to come ashore and work with Sicilians and Italians to try to get intel into where the Germans were. So you would have these scenarios where the American military came ashore and would say, hey, look, we told the Germans that we gave you the wrong place, but here's where the mines are so you can dig them up, and here's the people to meet with when you come in there. So the mob really played a role in that invasion. Where we get into silly season is you either have people who go, oh, that story is just all BS, or you have people saying, yes, Lucky Luciano stormed ashore waving a flag that said L, and the townspeople came rallying behind him. No such thing ever happened. But there is no question mob help was sought. There is no question mob help was received. How do we put a value on it? And I don't know how you put a value on it any more than I can say that if a soldier, served in World War II and served honorably, he contributed. It doesn't mean he won the war, but he contributed. And that's what we can say about the mob.
The claim that mobsters like Luciano helped the Allies land in Sicily, that's pretty legendary. So when we talk about fact versus folklore, it sounds like it's about 60% on the fact end, based on what you're saying.
I I think that that's right. I mean, look, when there was an investigation when Luciano was freed from prison and deported to figure out how much was true. And I was able to get a hold of these documents before they were made public. After 9/11, as you can imagine, there was a lot of question. What are we willing to do to deal with these people? What are we willing to do to deal with al-Qaeda? Because in wartime, you have to be tougher than you would be otherwise. And people in the intelligence community started finding documents and sharing them with me that showed really what the American military and the American government was willing to do. And they were not screwing around with Nazi saboteurs. I mean, you had Nazi saboteurs, by the way, who came ashore on Long Island in, I think it was 1942, later mid-1942, with bombs and plans to blow up American chemical plants, to blow up aluminum plants, to blow up Jewish-owned department stores. And, I mean, this is not made up. And the reason why this was so feared is around the time of World War I, the Germans blew up a munitions plant outside of New York in North Jersey where the explosions were felt as far away as Maryland. And so, the idea of German sabotage, I mean, it was at the time the biggest non-nuclear explosion on record. I think it was around 1912, 1914. And so there was reason to fear it. So I do think there was reason to work with mobsters. I mean, frankly, the government didn't care. When they started caring was after the World War II, where the only thing worse than going into business with the mob and failing is what would happen if it succeeded. You're in business with the mob. Nobody really was too thrilled to talk about that. And so some of the people who got involved, the Navy commander, his name was Charles Hoffenden, in running the program, he found himself being interviewed under oath and having a real problem on his hands because he had done business with the mob. And, here the mob had participated to the extent you want to call it honorably. Meyer, a lot of these guys really wanted to be a patriot. Meyer was so enthralled with his work with the military that he sent his son Paul to West Point.
In terms of, well, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. But this most surprising thing about our conversation, not only today, but the previous one on the radio, is the Harry Truman aspect of it. Harry Truman and the Kansas City Machine. And you described Truman as scoring highest on your mob adjacency scale. Was Truman fully aware of the extent of mob control in his political machinery?
Absolutely. And in fact, he was so aware of it that when he was president, they came to him for a favor. Some of the Chicago guys were jammed up in a scandal involving extorting the unions in Hollywood. And while he was president, the mobsters hired lobbyists and lawyers to try to get these Chicago outfit leaders, namely Paul Ricca, who was considered the boss at that time, to try to get him freed. And so what they ended up doing was they would say, hey, look, the guy is in Georgia. Can he at least be in prison closer to home? And so then they would bring him to Leavenworth, which was a little closer to Chicago. Hey, now that he's here, and is it really that big a deal? Can he be in a prison even closer to Illinois? And so that's the kind of thing that happened. And I think that that Truman returned the favor. He was very aware of it. There's no way he couldn't have been aware of it. But my speculation is the way he rationalized it was, if I don't take money, and there's no evidence that he did, I will write this off as something I had to do in the service of a larger cause. We all have ways of justifying things about our jobs we don't like, and that was his. By the way, the explosion outside New Jersey was 1916. I was wrong. I said 1914. My brain is going fried with all these numbers.
Understandable. I'm amazed you're keeping them all as straight as you are. I've covered a lot of mafia trials, and in all of the Colombo trials, a name that keeps popping up again and again is Greg Scarpa. And for the benefit of the audience that may not know this, Greg Scarpa, a.k.a. the Grim Reaper, was one of the most fascinating people in mafia history because he was a vicious mobster, killed all sorts of people. That's how he got the name, the Grim Reaper. His other nickname was the Killing Machine. But while he was doing all of this killing, he was working as a top echelon informant for the federal government who knew apparently that he was carrying out these murders. And his FBI handler, Lindley DeVecchio, even went on trial in Brooklyn for helping him carry out some of these murders. It's amazing to me because I view Greg Scarpa very much as an almost present day figure. You cover Greg Scarpa very much as a historical figure. Yeah. Talk to me about LBJ's use of Greg Scarpa to pressure the KKK. That's pretty interesting, pretty shocking. Was there precedent for using known criminals as unofficial government enforcers like that?
Well, was there precedent? I think the government does what the government wants to do. They use criminals in ways that they want to, and they're able to get away with it because they're the government. But what happened here was Lyndon Johnson built his political strength on civil rights. He passed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. Well, he got himself into some trouble because around that time, in 64, civil rights workers in Mississippi went missing. And that was the same time period that Joe Valachi had flipped, but he flipped openly. He was a Genovese guy. And what wasn't known for 30 years is somebody else flipped around that time, and that was Greg Scarpa. Now, some of the stuff this reporting has altered over the years because the most famous story about Scarpa is he was recruited to go down to Mississippi. I mean, if you saw the movie Mississippi Burning, which is relevant given the passing of Gene Hackman, the way it was portrayed in that movie was that an FBI agent, African-American, worked over a KKK guy to give up the location of the 3 civil workers' bodies. We don't know for sure that Scarpa was the one used for that particular torture job. I put the chances at 60% that it was Scarpa. But what I was able to figure out is he was certainly used for other situations where he was sent down to Mississippi, paid a good amount of money to torture via razor blade and revolver KKK figures to giving up the murderers. There was also, in addition to the 3 civil rights workers that are very, very famous for the Mississippi burning, or My Burn case known as to the FBI, he was also used to help find the killers of another civil rights leader named Vernon Dahmer, who was the KKK didn't like, especially because he was a fair-skinned African-American man who was considered to be, if they're using fair-skinned people, they're trying to, fool the public. And he was killed in a fire. What's interesting to me is the documents I found where Hoover is saying, we are not going to tell the grand jury, if this comes to an investigation or a trial, how we got this information. Do not say it. And now, what do we have from LBJ? We have LBJ on tape saying to Hoover, I don't care what you have to do. I know what you're doing to these communists. Do what you do to them and try to solve these crimes. And Hoover, of course, was not exactly one of the great civil rights people of our time. And so Hoover, he didn't want it known how he was going to do it. But they used Greg Scarpa to torture these guys. And so when it came time for there to be grand jury hearings. I mean, I show memos in the book saying we're not going to tell you how we got the information. Screw that. We're not going to tell you. And there's a reason for that, because what the FBI wanted to do is to do what Hoover did throughout his career. We used our great investigative resources and our crack team to use the greatest forensics to bring down the bad guys so that the good guys could prevail in the American way. Well, no, what he did is he got a mobster to torture some guys. But that's not a very, very popular story, and I was able to get federal people to basically say to me, to say to me on background, look, we've come to accept that Scarpa definitely did at least some of this stuff. So there you go.
I believe it. I mean, if you look at his history in dealing with the federal government, I don't think that would come as much of a surprise. Let's talk about the president following Johnson, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon and his friendship with Bebe Rebozo has raised plenty of questions. Was Rebozo just a loyal friend, or was there something more sinister at play?
Well, he was a loyal friend, and I think that what's interesting about Nixon is he was always scrounging around for money. And Rebozo was helpful in that area, helped set him up in business deals in this Florida business mob swamp, which I talk about a lot. And, Rebozo had a bank, and the bank was a bank that processed some mob money. Was Bebe Rebozo a mobster? No, he was a businessman who dealt with who he had to deal with in order to get things done. But to me, Rebozo was among the least interesting of the mob component of Richard Nixon's career. I mean, first of all, Richard Nixon got support from mobsters in L.A. Mickey Cohen, the L.A. mobster, held a fundraiser for him. Nixon came to it. They got a lot of fundraising from mob figures back in the 50s. One of the things these guys had in common was that Nixon hated communists, and the mob communism was the best thing that ever happened to them, because the real reason Hoover didn't go after them was not because they had something on him, but because he was going after communists. That's what he wanted to do. And so the mob was like, by all means, go after the communists. The mob helped fund some of these anti-communist groups. And so Nixon was very interesting there. What was most interesting is historically, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but for your listeners, labor was a Democratic thing. But Nixon began to bring them around to Republicans because, first of all, Jimmy Hoffa was being chased by the Kennedys, so Hoffa was not going to endorse JFK. Nixon saw an opportunity. And so what Nixon did is he wanted to secure labor. And how did he do it? He figured commuting Hoffa's sentence would make people really think that he was a labor guy, but also what the mob wanted. They didn't want Jimmy Hoffa back, because Hoffa was making noise that I'm going to come back and take my union. He thought the union was his. And I think that what the mob wanted is his successor, Frank Fitzsimmons. They wanted him to be in power. And so Nixon commutes Hoffa's sentence. Fitzsimmons is in power. Fitzsimmons and Nixon are very, very tight. Nixon gets rank and file support. And all of this, Nixon's commutation of, it wasn't a pardon, of Hoffa, set in motion Hoffa's ultimate disappearance and murder, because Hoffa said, no, I'm not going away. I'm coming back. And he decided he's going to become a whistleblower. Come on. I mean, no, you're not going to become a whistleblower, and that set it in motion. The other two things that were interesting to me about Nixon, probably my favorite, one, there's something that I find hilarious, and one I find serious. The hilarious one is some mob guys tipped off some bank robbers that Nixon kept some of his campaign cash money in a bank in California, and these mobsters and bank robbers hated Nixon, and they decided to go steal his money, and they broke into a bank in Southern California in 1972 and stole $6 to $9 million of Nixon's money.
Wow!
The robbery was so ham-handed that they literally blew some of the roof off of the bank robbery, and everybody thought it was an earthquake, and nobody investigated it. They ended up being caught, and the bank robber chief, they were caught a few weeks later because one of the geniuses, as they were great bank robbers, they were not good at getting away with stuff, and one of the bank robbers ended up not turning on the washing machine where they were staying, and they got their fingerprints off the dishes. But I just love the idea of the mob-tied bank robbers stealing Nixon's money, because how does the Nixon campaign report it? What do you do?
Right.
I mean, do you go and say, "Hey, I want my money back that is being used for illicit reasons"? So I just found that absolutely hilarious, and I have a dark sense of humor, so I love that stuff. The other thing that I thought was interesting is, in terms of Watergate, there were constant references to Nixon looking to find out more of what he called the Bay of Pigs thing. And one of the arguments I make is that one possible motive, because nobody really knows for sure what they were looking for at the Watergate headquarters, is they sent in Cubans to do the bank job. I believe that Nixon was very concerned that as VP under Eisenhower, he was aware of the Castro assassination attempts. And I think that it didn't mean that he was the point man on it, but some people think he was, but that he knew about it. And I think a credible argument could be made that he was very worried about what would surface, given all of the attention that was beginning to happen around that time to the Bobby Kennedy assassination, the Martin Luther King assassination, the JFK assassination. Am I going to get jammed up as having had knowledge about an assassination program? What's going to happen, especially if I'm going to end up running against Teddy Kennedy in 72. Now, I am not going so far as to saying that is the reason for the Watergate break-in. I'm going so far as to say that some of the people who were involved with the Watergate episode have said, we don't know which thing it was that he was obsessed about, but this is as good as any.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs, but luckily there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
We could go through all the other presidents. I'm going to skip over Reagan for the moment, but just let's talk about the two most recent presidents, if we can, briefly, because if time permits, I'd love to explore a couple other aspects of your book and of this whole. Yeah, Trump and Biden. Obviously, a lot of people know of Trump's ties to the construction business, and at a time when the construction business was very mobbed up. What do we know about Trump's dealing with the mob? What do we know about Joe Biden's dealing with the mob?
Trump is fascinating because he's the only one of these presidents who has openly admitted to dealing with the mob. He's been on Letterman saying he dealt with them. And it's fascinating because it not only hasn't hurt him, it's helped him as part of his branding of dealing with tough guys. And one of the things Donald Trump always says that drives people crazy when he's accused of something naughty is he says, that just makes me smart. Well, whether you love Trump or hate him, he may be right on that point, because let me tell you how he dealt with the mob. In the case of Trump Tower, if you picture construction, you probably picture Manhattan towers being built. You picture steel going up. Trump used concrete, not steel. Steel is an international industry. Concrete was controlled at that time by two companies controlled mostly by the Genovese, Gambino, and Columbus. Some interest with others. So by using concrete, what Trump did was he simply paid them well. There is no law against paying concrete companies well to build your building. Well, if you happen to get labor peace in the process, who knew that would be such a benefit? but you cannot prove that it is illegal to receive mob labor peace by compensating concrete companies well. So when Trump says things like, that makes me smart, he may be right, because a lot of the people involved with that process went to jail, the mobsters. Also, I grew up near Atlantic City, and one of the things, and a colorful uncle, I'll say, told me, I said, what's this business about Trump and the mob? This was a conversation probably 35 years ago. And he said, it's really simple. He overpays for real estate. A Philly mobster, a guy named Salvi Testa, whose dad was Phil Testa, was the boss.
Chicken man.
The chicken man. They blew up the chicken man in Philly last night. Salvi Testa was selling a property that was worth $195,000. Trump paid $1.1 million. He's allowed to do that. And Trump had peace and a nice parking garage with little problem. Show me that it's illegal to pay that way. The other thing Trump had going for him is Roy Cohn, who was able to deal with the mob under the banner of privilege, because if you do something under the banner of privilege, while it may not necessarily be legally privileged, it's very hard to prove that if Donald Trump met with Fat Tony Salerno at Roy Cohn's office or condo, they could have just been passing in the lobby. You can't say what happens in a lawyer's office is illegal. And one prosecutor friend of mine said, yeah, but Eric, if they could prove that what Trump did was that he benefited from mob help, that's a crime. And I said, it's been 45 years. Nobody's proven anything. And so here we are. And so, and if you want to say Trump dealt with the mob, well, turn on Letterman. He says it. He said it repeatedly. So where do you go with it? There's nowhere to go. So I find it fascinating because that's pretty much out in the open. Biden's a different story. It's one was his family background. His father dealt with these skeezy, mob-connected bootlegger types who were doing things like selling these cheap, faulty grave vaults. Grave as in cemetery, that it was these schemes and scams, not necessarily illegal, but they got into some trouble with it. The most interesting thing with Biden was when he was running for Senate in 1972, behind. He was a kid. He was 29 years old. And there was an attack campaign done against him to appear on the eve of the elections in Delaware newspapers. Well, the Teamsters, through Frank Sheeran of the Irishman fame, made sure that the newspapers were never picked up and distributed around Delaware. And Biden won. Now, is there proof that Biden knew? No. Did Biden have Teamster support? Yes. But here is a situation where Biden benefited from the help of organized crime in the 1972 election by the Teamsters making sure that the ads that were supposed to really keep him down, didn't get picked up.
That's wild. Before I let you go, in your research, did you find instances where mob connections didn't just serve a political campaign, but actively influenced policy decisions?
I think that with labor, yes. I think that Reagan had the support of Jackie Presser of the Teamsters Union. And I think that there is a feeling that while there's no evidence of changing hands, that getting support from the Teamsters probably led to some of what Reagan did to pulling some punches, because Reagan was loathed back in his California days, yet he received the support of the Teamsters throughout his presidency. And there's reason to believe that some of the policy decisions were impacted to some degree by the help that was received from the Teamsters. I mean, I'm not a creature of the mafia, even though I know about it. My career began in the White House. I'm a creature of Washington, where I've been for 40 years. I'm retired from my business. I'm just a writer now. But one of the things you see is a lot of what happens in Washington is what didn't happen. what policy doesn't get permitted, what punches are pulled. And I do believe that support from labor and the movement from labor, from the Democrats to Republicans, has resulted in some policy decisions. But it's hard to say this bill or that bill is evidence of it.
And finally, for real, this time, you have done such a magnificent job with this book. After writing this book and after researching it, are there any lingering mysteries about presidential mob connections that you think deserve a little more attention?
I think the one that I would want to debunk is the one that J. Edgar Hoover was controlled by the mob. I mean, I think, put simply, the rumor that's been in books is that Meyer Lansky had a photograph in his private belongings of Hoover in a compromising position, the theory being Hoover was gay. I've been through a lot of Meyer Lansky's records, and his business partner, Jimmy Alo, has said it is absolutely preposterous that Meyer kept a photo. There was never any damn photo. And, in fact, Hoover virtually chased Meyer out of the country. And wouldn't that have been a nice time to use the photo? The reason why Hoover didn't go after the mob until much later, he did go after them, was, I mean, especially after at the Appalachian meeting. Hoover didn't go after the mob for several reasons. Number one, he was focused on communists. That wasn't just his focus. It was the focus of the Congress. It was the focus of the intelligence community. It was the focus of the presidency. There was big dividends in getting the Rosenbergs and others. Second, I think Hoover recognized the mob was too amorphous. If it had been a centralized corporation, he would have probably gone after them sooner. But the feeling at the time was it was a local affair. There were Chicago gangsters and Kansas City gangsters and New York gangsters. It was the job of the local authorities. If he starts getting jammed up in that, how do you start putting points on the board when you're at war with the locals? Let them do it. Because what did Hoover care about? Power. How do you get power? You keep getting appointed and you keep getting budgets. And so I think that those were really the major reasons. I also think Hoover was probably concerned, if he went after the mob, about getting corrupted. And one of the things I point out in the book is I have a handwritten note where he says, if I had known then what I knew now, I would have taken this more seriously. But it didn't really happen until after the Appalachian Conference in any meaningful way. Besides, further proof that Meyer Lansky wasn't behind it is, well, everybody says Meyer Lansky's behind everything, which is one of my pet peeves. But Hoover launched something called Operation Financier, which was the whole campaign to knock off Lansky. And so I think what people need to understand is they have to climb out of their little conspiracy fantasies and look at very mundane reasons why certain things happen, and understand that the mafia involvement with presidents was not that they were secretly pulling strings from the cabinet room, but they were greasing the skids along the way because of their power locally, at the state level, and with unions.
Fascinating book. I hope everybody checks it out. Really thoroughly researched and incredibly well written. The book is called Wise Guys and the White House: Gangsters, Presidents, and the Deals They Made. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's been my pleasure. If you want to comment on any aspect of our conversation, you're welcome to email me. You can reach me at frank.morano. That's frank.morano at redappleaudionetworks.com. If somebody sent you this podcast, please do us a favor and pass it on to anybody that you know, either via social media or sending it along via email. And you can absolutely be sure to subscribe to the Racket Report on any podcast app to make sure you never miss another episode. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.